Well, this is the under the hood data migration session. FileMaker just released a new tool with 17 called the FileMaker Data Migration Tool. My name's Clay Mackel. I'm the Chief Software Architect. Is that what the title? Chief Software Architect? Yeah, I don't know. It's, yeah, I've just been at the company so long, and I really just call myself the historian. It's pretty much my main purpose. Okay, so the agenda for today, I'm going to talk a little bit what are the use cases for migrating data, why people do it. Problems that are doing data migration with, hopefully it's now historical reasons why it's hard to migrate data, but go through some of the reasons why it was not as easy to migrate data before the migration tool came out. I'll talk a little bit about some of the design decisions that went into the migration tool, why we decided to do what we did, why it's a command line tool, some stuff like that. I'll go through also with the design decision, I'll talk about what it does. I've been getting quite a few questions and stuff like that, so I've actually added quite a few more slides than what was published on the website already. My demos are going to probably get tighter at the end and not talk about them nearly as much. Command line tool doesn't really make a very hot demo anyway, but I'll tell you some things about what we're not expecting you to do with the tool or what it's not designed for. And then kind of get in the demo section, a customer's usage. I have a 4-minute movie where I'm going through showing the process. If I'm running too late, I might just cut that out and give you more time for questions. I've been working at Apple. I started at Apple in '86. They moved the software over to a separate company called Claris, became FileMaker. I've done initial ports of Windows, worked on the first version server, instant web publishing, Draco Engine, Go. When I have other free time, I work on car and tractor restorations. This one I think is finally operational again. I got the differential fixed, so I can maybe drive it when I get home. Also, the data migration tool was something, I don't know, I think I spec'd maybe 3 years ago or something like that. I wrote what I wished it to do and gave a general outline for it. Another team was working on it. They did the initial design, so some people say, oh, you did the whole thing, but no, there was quite a bit of work done by this other team that worked out some of the issues of how the workflow was going to work, come up with how to do the field matching and a lot of the algorithms for what they did. And then they had a version that was working. Now, I did rewrite all their code. So all the code is my code, but you know, it's a lot easier to write code once you have a prototype of something that you say, well, that isn't quite what I want. And I had the opportunity to be able to start over from scratch. So it's always nice when you have time to do that. So why do customers migrate data? I mean, I guess the use cases we were looking at, it was a series of us looking at it, to follow this DATP pattern, development, testing, acceptance, and production. A lot of people, very often it's cut down to just the 3 steps, where you just do development in one place, then you have a testing phase, and then you have your production phase. But if you go in some of the schooling and studies, they really want you to have 4 stages, but you know, we always try to save some time. We can cut out the acceptance stage. No one needs that. And what you're doing during this time is you have a production system where customers are doing live work and stuff like that. You don't want to do live development, though. If you really want to cut all the steps out, you could do live development and stuff like that. But there's been many topics about why you probably don't want to do that. I mean, you don't want live scripts running while you're changing schema in midstream because you have no idea what's going to go on at that point. You really want to work elsewhere. But you still have the problem is that, okay, you spent all this time working on making new scripts, new schema, and stuff like that. And then you want to go through and you want to do the testing phase, but maybe you have a completely different set of testing data. You have all your test suites already written. You have all your test logic, almost like in the talk that was in here just previously. You've gone through and you've written all these tests that you run on all your models to validate it with your changes and stuff like that. So you want to run all those, but you have all this test data already to drive that stuff. So the tool can be used during this part to pull all your test data into your new solution, so then you can run your tests on it. And then you just repeat that process to go the more important process where time is more of an issue. The amount of time it takes you to transition from development to testing or to acceptance isn't really, well, it's better to always do things in less time, but the key part is when you go into your production system. You want to have your production system down as short a possible time as possible. The other migration case that's very often is upgrading vertical market apps. You go through, you've created this app, there's a bunch of customers out in the world using your system. You come up with a new version, maybe you're going to charge for it, maybe not, maybe it's just bug fixes or whatever, but you want to push your solution out there. And somehow you have to get your solution out there and have the data pulled in that they're currently using. Whether you're doing it themselves or you send them a package or an executable or something that they run on their machine, you need some type of process to be able to move their data into your new solution. And the last one is basically going backwards. You may have a solution that's up and running, you put in a new system, you put in some new scripts and stuff like that, and it's running, and all of a sudden you're saying, oh no, there's something terribly wrong going on, but I have 18 hours of new data that's been added into the database. I can't just roll back to the backup. I need to keep this data. So what you can do in this case is create a clone of the backup of the last point that you knew everyone was happy with, and then migrate the data backwards into an older version of your solution. So this is kind of like a recovery scheme or some way to not necessarily you're moving forward, but you need to move backwards for some reason. But with FileMaker, this conversation has occurred many times, and there's been many different solutions and talks about how to do data migration. There's products that are out there that have done it. But it's not a very easy solution. There's some complexities that make things fragile, and there's some things that you just can't do. Some of the more complex things is like you have to do imports of each table independently, and you actually have to use the import step. Now, as you guys saw on Monday, we're doing some improvements in that area to make that easier, but still, it's kind of a hard process currently to do it, and you have to do it for each table. And you have to be very careful with auto-enter data and serial numbers. You have to make sure you remember to update those properly if you're using them. Now, if you've gone to some of the newer techniques where you're using just random UUIDs, and you don't have to worry about that part, but some business logics still require actual serial numbers because they want invoice numbers and all that type of stuff, and or you haven't had time to move to a new model, or you just maybe don't like UUIDs for some reason. There's some things that you can't work around. Currently, there's no mechanism inside FileMaker to move user accounts from one file to the other. That's just a stop right there. If you have a deployed solution, a production server with user accounts in there, there's really no way to move them ad hoc directly in there. You can maybe, if you've been keeping a copy of all the accounts in some other table, you can maybe use the scripting steps to create new user accounts and stuff like that. But still, there's really not a very good resolution of what you can do if you could just move the user accounts over. And scripted imports, even though you can do all the inputs and stuff like that, when you're doing imports through the client product, even if it's standalone, not even if it's going through server, FileMaker is still doing all this transactional processing, it's doing locking. You don't have to be multi-user to have to worry about data record locking. There can be multiple windows around inside the system. So FileMaker is always doing locking, making sure that other processes or other sessions can't modify it, even if it's just another window. The transaction processing, all the record changes are being copied into another location, and then when the commit operation is done, then it's copied into the final location. And re-indexing. There's no way to completely skip the indexing phase on imports. It has to index. But there's some people using the technique where you delete the index, import, and then re-index everything at once, or you just let the index grow during the same time. But it'd be nice to be able to skip some of this stuff if you don't need to do it. So we came up with a different, some of the decisions and some of the things we were talking about. We wanted to have a single user command line tool for Windows and Mac. There's not one for Linux now. We may or may not do one, or we may have one internally and not sell it just like the server. It is a command line tool. We decided to go with source and clones as the input mechanisms, the source file and a clone file, instead of having you maybe create an XML file with all the rules and stuff like that. We wanted something that was pretty straightforward and simple and easy to work around. A major requirement was that we didn't want to require a complete schema matches between tables. We know you're adding fields, you're changing calculations and stuff like that. It had to handle that. And the key thing, like I was mentioning before, why it's so slow in some places is that we wanted to be able to analyze the differences between the two files and try to do the minimal amount of work. If there was a column that had a stored calculated data or just stored data, and it wasn't being changed at all, there's no need to rebuild the index. We can just copy the index from the file and put it into the destination. So there's a lot of analysis going on looking at which calcs have changed, and if you did change a calc that depends on another calc, and you have that cascade of effect changes. There's all this analysis going on to determine which indexes need to be rebuilt and which ones do not. So we try to minimize the amount of work we have to do during the migration. Get a little bit more details. The command line tool, minimal interaction. Also, being a command line tool and how we distribute it is not part of the baseline product. There's no GUI. We don't have to worry about localizing it. The docs are quite a bit smaller and stuff like that. So we can actually iterate this thing faster if we need to. It's easier for us to do. It's easier to test. Just the cycle of having a command line tool is quicker for us. This command line tool, since it's not part of the entire world or the rest of the Draco subsystems, we can take advantage of threading a lot more inside of it. We can work on multiple tables at the same time as we're going through and doing the analysis and then splitting things up and working on the different tables. We require a 64-bit operating system. This is one of the reasons why I did end up rewriting it. The first version was designed to run on a 32-bit operating system. But there's some speed improvements, things you can do if you can assume that you have a 64-bit memory space. You don't have to worry about memory allocation problems. You don't have to worry about if the index can fit into 2 gigabytes. If there's bigger chunks of data like that, I can go ahead and allocate it. I can use that. With a 32-bit operating system, you have to go through and make sure you chunk things, which means you have to put another level of indirection basically on top of everything to make sure you can live in a 32-bit memory space. We wanted a different type logging. Instead of going into a window, we wanted it to go to a standard output so you could run it through other tools. So as the tool is running, it's spitting the information, the logging information, which you can put at different levels. It spits it out the standard output, which then you can run into other command line tools like T or grep or whatever you want to do and process it however you want. It makes it a lot more flexible with the output coming from it. And then it's easier to add options and stuff like that. It kind of goes back to the whole GUI thing, is that if we had a GUI and then we decided that, oh, there's some other command line option that we want to add, we'd have to figure out where to put it on the GUI space, make the Windows version and the Mac version and stuff like that. This makes it a lot easier. Just, oh, when a new option, just add a couple lines of code and it's in there already. Well, depends what the option actually does. Sometimes it's pretty simple. Like, I don't know, there's going to be a version command line option. Someone got quite a few requests where they wanted, they just want the version to be spit out so they can just run the command line tool and just get the version by itself so they didn't have to parse anything. I mean, that took, maybe like 30 seconds to implement. So, some options are actually easy to do. So here's the command line option, or the output if you just run the tool without any parameters or anything like that. It kind of shows the parameters. I'll be talking about the source files, the clone files. Those are the main 2 inputs to it. You have control over the target paths, where the output will go to, whether you want to overwrite. By default, it won't overwrite another file, but you can force it with the force option. I'll go through talk about what ignore valueless, ignore accounts, ignore fonts are, and then there's some logging controls at the bottom. Note that we are up at version 17.02. With the V2 release, we did upgrade the migration tool too. The V2 release, I think really only has one bug that was fixed in it, and that was non-ASCII passwords on Windows operating systems. We weren't, the character set, I thought UTF-8 was coming in, and it wasn't actually UTF-8. It was coming in whatever character set the system happened to be set to for that moment. So it would work on some machines, but not other machines. So that's the version there. Now, something I have been noticing as I've been seeing other people's demos and going to their websites and looking at it, is that there's some versions from the ETS release that seem to be floating around and stuff like that aren't the official V1 release either. There were some bug fixes that were made between the last version that were given to ETS people and the official V1 release. So please stop using those versions. Just download the V2 version, and as long as you see 1702, or if someone gives you this tool as part of a solution to upgrade, just make sure you're at least using the 02 release to make sure that these older the first version of the V1s, the multiple V1s, that last number is actually the build number, so that's build 205. We tend to reset the build numbers at the next 100, so V3 will start at build 300 and et cetera like that. But that's not necessarily always true either. Sometimes the build numbers gets out of sync. So we have the source, clone, and target files. We require for these files to do the migration on them, we require that you have admin access to it. That's actually how the first initial versions that went out, and we got a bunch of pushback from the first ETS users of it, that they really wanted a more secure way, because we did realize that, if you're going to be sending this tool out to other people, especially, now if it's in-house, it's probably not much of a problem, but if you're trying to upgrade a solution that was sold, where you're sending the updater to them, they would actually have to know what the full admin account was for it. And you probably don't want to give your end users the full admin access to the file. So we have this other mechanism where you can add another account to the files and give them this new external extended privileges that start with the prefix FMMigration, and they can use that account. Now that account, you can have them have no access at all to the file if they actually logged in with that account. You can make it just a migration only account, maybe, or if you have a read only account, you can assign it to the read only account. But it doesn't actually matter what the actual privilege is to the data. If it has that migration extended privilege, then they can run the migration tool on it. That's completely different than any other permissions. So migration doesn't include read or write, because migration is actually not even using most of the Draco engine to do most of the work. It's working at a lower level. It's just picking up, when it's running in the block mode, it's just picking up chunks of blocks, moving it from one file to the other file. It's not even looking at what the contents of them are. The clone file, some people don't realize what a clone is, or haven't ever used it. And there's been some confusion about what the clone file is. It was originally mainly made for international purposes. Simply when a FileMaker file is created on a machine, it picks up the month, day, year order, the number separator, I think the currency separator. It picks up a whole bunch of like locale or localization information from the system and embeds it at a very low level in the file format. At that point, everything inside that file format is stored using those options. Numbers will be stored using that number separator. Dates will be stored in that date order, because we store everything as text. Numbers, dates, times, they're actually all stored as text inside the file format. That's one reason why you can switch between text and numbers so quickly. Save a clone basically saves a copy of the file with no locale information in it. That file is pretty much unusable as is, because because it has no data in it, it doesn't need that locale information in it. The first time you open a file in FileMaker or Server or almost any other FileMaker product except the data migration tool, that clone is modified to put in the current locale into it. So the minute you open it, it's no longer a clone. And the file doesn't actually say clone on the outside or anything like that. You can actually notice this if you make a clone file, you make it read-only, and then you try to open it. Server or FileMaker will refuse to open it because it can't put the clone information into that file. That's one way to detect if it's a clone. I think it's actually even a special error string that comes up that very few people typically see. But since the clone file doesn't have any locale information at all, so during the migration tool, this new file, at the lower level, really what happens is that the clone file is then copied to the location of where the target is, and then all the data is moved from the source file into it. But also the locale information from the source file is moved into the target file that's created. And for those of you who don't know where the clone is created, if you go in Save As, there's a pop-up menu called Type at the bottom. You'll want to go through and make sure you select Clone there. And then it changes the file name to be file name space clone at the end of it. A little bit more about this extended privilege. I kind of described why you want to do it. You don't want to give them full access. Now this FMMigration extended privilege is a prefix, like I mentioned. It's very much like the FM reauthenticate extended privilege. Is that the FM reauthenticate privilege in there that's been there for quite a few releases. I forgot when that went in. Is a prefix, and then there's a number at the end of it that determines, how long they can be offline or before it requires them to reauthenticate to open the file again or to reconnect to the file. This is very similar that FMMigration is a prefix type extended privilege. And what you need to do is, when you do this and you create an account with this, this is kind of your secret. This is the thing that is binding your clone to your source file. Both the clone and the source file has to have the same exact extended privilege starting with FMMigration. Now, users can never see this information. Only full admins can see this. There should be no calc functions. There's been some discussion whether we should even spit it out into the new DDR format and stuff like that. We're kind of still worrying about that a little bit. But at this point, your clone and that both have to have the same one. It's case insensitive. So you end up creating these two accounts, and then when you use the the migration tool, when you specify the account name and the password, you specify these whatever account has these privileges, or this extended privilege, and it'll use it. Or you can use the full admin. Actually, one thing is that if you're using, you pretty much have to do both. You can't use one with full admin and one with the access admin privileges. You really have to keep it. You either use full admin on both or use the migration on both. So where you enter this stuff in the managed security panel, there's these extra tabs at the top. There's the third tab to the top is where you add extended privileges. This is where the FM reauthenticate keyword is also. This is where you turn on XML processing, WebDirect, the REST APIs, XML, and all that stuff. So what you do is, like here, I've entered my key. I added the description of a data migrator on it. I created a privilege set, a new privilege set called data migrator, and then I created the privileges to access basically nothing. You could assign the extended privilege to like the read-only if you don't mind. People that are doing migration can have access to like read-only to all of it, or you can give them custom ones, or if you have maybe a sub-administration privilege set, you could give the migration to that. That's up to your decision of who should have the ability to do migration. And then going back into accounts, in this case here, I created an account called Migrator with a password Migrator. And I just kind of make that, when I would push out my distribution and put a shot at my updater saying, oh, to use a migration tool, just use Migrator on the command line tool, and then you can use it on that solution. For schema match, I mentioned in the requirements that we wanted to be able to mix files that had schema that didn't quite exactly match. All the fields don't match. So the first thing we do when we're looking at either tables or fields, we look for matches by making sure that the name and ID match. So if we see that, then we say, okay, well, this field goes to this field. Then we look, if we match everything, then we're pretty much done. Then we look over, well, okay, what items did not match? Then we go through and we start doing matching by name. We start trying to find, maybe you deleted a field and then created a new field with the same name. So then we say, okay, well, that name goes to that name. And then the last point is that if you just renamed it completely, like you decided to go through and change your rules for your naming convention for your fields have changed, or naming conventions for tables have changed. We'll just match by ID then, the internal ID that's a part of each field and table. User accounts are matched, privileges are matched basically the same way, except that all the user accounts just come over unless you're using the ignore flag. If you don't want the user accounts to come from the main source file, you can use the ignore flag, and then the account information will come from the clone. There's some people that have their own security systems, and they actually change the user accounts when they push out a new VREV or a new rev of their solution. And there's no end user accounts that they want to keep. They actually want it to come from the new solution because they paranoid, or that's how their system works and stuff like that. So So the new user accounts come along, but we still have to do a matching mechanism to match the user accounts, because each of these user accounts in the source file were associated with a privilege set of some sort. When we bring them into the clone, we have to figure out which privilege set they need to match to there. And then, so it uses basically the same matching rules. It looks by name and ID, because each privilege set has a name and an ID. If you can't find that type of match, then it goes by name, and if not that, by ID. Now, the thing is that if there's no, in the first case where a field or a table where no match was found at all, we pretty much just ignore it. If it's in the source file, we won't copy it to the destination file. If it's in the destination file already, we just leave it as it is. But for accounts, if there's no match, we'll create a new privilege set called unmatched privileges that basically has no permissions and assign that user account to that privilege set. Because internally, we really can't have a user account that's not associated with any privilege set at all. Custom value lists are different. And there were some good reasons why the team that did this initial design said why it should be only by name only. And I can't remember offhand. Mainly because I guess the value lists move around and the ID isn't used that much in any other systems, but it only matches by name. And when I'm talking about custom value lists, I'm talking about really the value lists that just have where you physically type in the constants and the names in there. It's not the ones that are based off fields, not the ones based off relationships. So when the data migration tool starts working, the first thing it does is it looks at the user accounts, the value list, the font table updating, and the table, and then doing the table and field analysis. It's looking at all the tables, and once it finds matching tables, it looks at the fields in each of those. This is all done kind of on a single thread first at the starting process. It'll do this. Also note that the migration tool only does one migration at a time, and with one target file, one source file. You can't specify multiple targets and multiple sources. One reason as a command line tool is that you can easily fork that off. You can run multiple command lines at the same time. So if you want to migrate 13 files at the same time, you can fire off 13 tools if you really want. So we're still trying to keep the tool as simple as possible. It's just one-to-one. We're not going to keep adding more options to specify, oh, here's the list of files, here's the list of all the rules for all the options for each of the files. We're trying to make it kind of like, what the Unix, the Unix way of doing things. You want to have, simple component tools that then you put together into larger solutions. So then based on this analysis that we go through, we're making some decisions. I'm going to come back and talk about the font logic, because that actually is one of the big sections I kind of added to this, because I've been getting a lot of questions about that. And it is kind of complex, and I have to kind of go into the history of how the FileMaker stores fonts. But based on these results, we can know whether we can do block style or record mode style migration. If you had some of the earlier versions of this tool, it was called slow and fast, but due to marketing reasons, it was like, well, slow compared to what? Or, well, it's not as slow as doing file imports, but it's not as fast. Well, you're saying, well, we can solve this problem by just using completely different names. And it's easy when you can fix it by just definition. Because I've seen some websites where you see the log spitting out fast mode and slow mode on it. They came from earlier versions of the tool when it did say that. But the block mode is moving the tables. Yesterday, if you were at my talk, I was showing that there's this tree structure, how FileMaker stores stuff. Block mode means we're just picking up whole portions of the tree, pick it up, move it over to the other file, and just drop it. We're not looking at the contents. We're not going through any transactional processing. We're not doing any locking, because the locking structure is basically on tree nodes and stuff like that, and it's very complex. But this is one reason why the tool can go so much faster. Because basically when you get down to those 4K blocks, we know that this tree represents these, a part of this block, all these blocks through this range and this block. We can just basically pick them all up, move them over, and copy them to the new file. That's where most of the speed of this tool comes from, is when you're running in block mode. But during the analysis, when you were doing this, sometimes we have to do some stuff where we can't just pick up the entire tree and move it over there. We may have to rebuild some of the indexes, because you maybe changed a number to a text field or vice versa, or you had a stored calculation where you changed the calculated value. Instead of adding, the due date, you can say, well, I'm going to give everyone more, 10 more days to pay their bills or something like that. So you go in the stored calc and add plus 10 or something like that. To do that, we actually have to change all the values that are stored in that table. So we can't just do the block move. We actually have to do some of the processing that the mainline product does. So that's when you get kicked into record mode. So we'll go through, and then we're still kind of doing bulk moves of data. We'll bulk move the contents basically over there, but then we'll start editing it. We may be deleting repetitions, like if the number of repetitions changed in a field. Actually, if you add more repetitions, we don't have to do anything. We can still use block mode because there's no new repetition data to do it. But if you shrink the number of repetitions, we have to truncate data and we have to remove data from the tree, so we have to go into record mode. So this whole analysis part, which basically this other team did, they came through and came with all the rules, everything I had to follow. So it was a nice set of instructions when I was working on the code, what to do, because they figured all that stuff out for me. So there's the record, recalculating indexing forces you into record mode, and then I actually should have mentioned in there that font differences may cause problems. And I'll come back to that later. But there's other reasons that we may be stuck in record mode. And then the logging, the big difference between the normal logging and the verbose logging is that the normal logging tends not to spit out anything that's the same. If it moved an entire table and there was no differences at all, it won't spit it out in the logging, where the verbose mode it will. So it just kind of shows you that there were differences of things that occurred. Going back to if you're running with full access mode, if you have the accounts with full access, you basically can see the full logs. But if you're using an account that's hooked up to the FMMigration extended privilege, we only spit out a summary. Because there's actually a lot of information in that log about the internal, formats. They're saying, the person doing the migration may be worried that saying, oh, all of a sudden there's a new table called people to fire. You don't want them to see that. All they'll see is the summary log saying, one new table added. You won't have any, information that may worry someone else. More details about some of the things that happen. So I've been getting questions. Some of this has been on forums, some of it has been locally, some of it I've been getting different questions about this all over the place. So people are worried about external data and plugins, or externally stored containers and plugins. Pretty much the data migration tool ignores externally stored containers. Containers, when they're stored externally, what's inside the record is basically a pointer with a partial path of how to get to the file. If it's encrypted, it has what the decryption key is for that container, and some other metadata. I think it has the last size it knew it was to help the imaging code, so it doesn't have to necessarily load it to figure out how to lay out the layout and stuff like that. So the migration tool basically just is moving the data. There's no need for it to change any of this stuff. So if you are doing a data migration on a file that has external data, or external container data, you can copy the file down wherever you want, run the tool on the clone, create the new file. Just make sure you put that file back to the same relative location where it was, so that all the relative paths work. Now the one caveat that I have on that second bullet in there is, I don't know how often people do this, where they have stored calculated fields based on the contents of container fields that have external data in it. That is a lot of things, but okay, we have one hand down here, so there's someone doing that. Now, if you don't change anything that would trigger that calculation to change, you don't have to worry about it, because there's no change occurring. We don't need to recalculate it. We don't need to look up where the file is located. We don't need to bump or decrement the ref counts to the files. So there's no problem. You can use a migration tool there. But if you do something that changes what that stored calculation does, that means the migration tool has to start accessing all that remote container data. And I'm pretty sure not all the logic for doing handling remote container data is in the migration tool right now. So you want to avoid making those type changes, or pull all the container data back inside and do the conversion, or just be be careful about doing that. We may In a future version of the tool, maybe we'll try to handle this. I guess if we get feedback coming back, whether we really need to do this or not. Okay. And my one person I need to worry about here, if he says it's okay, then I'm good with it. How much money do I owe you? The other thing is plugins. Now plugins, I have an easier excuse for why we don't do it, because the server product doesn't do it. If you notice that if you have a stored calculated field that's dependent on the result of a plugin, and the file is hosted, and then you do something to change it so that that value needs to be recalculated on the server, you'll notice that you won't get the right results, because back in version 10, I think, somewhere around there, is when we stopped loading plugins into the main DBS process. That's when the SASE process was created, and we pushed plugins out into a separate process. But when server goes through and updates the schema and needs to recalculate all the values, it does that on the server itself. And in yesterday's talk, I gave you the document of all these other things that don't work. There's actually other calcs that don't work on the server too. They actually only get evaluated on the client. So you'd have this similar problem with that too. So for plugins, you basically, hopefully, you have the other thing is if you don't change anything inside a calc that requires that value to be recalculated, then you don't have to worry about it. Otherwise, there's one use case I'm going down here. He does have a lot of data that's stored with plugin values. He has his own plugin that he has in the system. But he's been doing migration for a long time, and he does this over the host, so he knows how to handle that. He basically goes through and just re-triggers. After he does the migration, after he brings up his new solution, he has this script that runs, and basically just does like a replace all on a column, touches one column that will cause all those calcs to get reevaluated, and then they'll get the proper values stored at that point. Can I use FileMaker data migration tool on pre-17 files? I know this is a question that's for my session in 2 hours or something like that, but it really kind of deserves to be here. Now, we did pretty extensive testing on 16 and 17. It won't open files before 12. You'll just get an error at that point if you try to use a file before 12. I wouldn't use it. I guess the best thing is don't try to migrate from a newer version to a previous version is the best thing. As long as you're going forward, you should be always fine. If you're going from like a 13 file to a 14 file. Also, I would avoid the 12 files. In 13, we added Korean support. So we actually had to change a lot of indexing logic inside there. So some of the index comparison and rules to see what needs to be changed and stuff like that may get confused. You may be able to somehow, normally if you add a Korean index in any version of FileMaker currently, 12 will refuse to open it. But I think if you use a migration tool, you'll be able to make a version that can be opened by 12, and then pretty much all your Korean data is going to get indexed in, you're going to end up with a big mess there. So I would avoid not using the migration tool to try to move anything to 12 at all. So, and our QA department hasn't actually really tested much before 16. Some people played with 15 and stuff like that. But the good rule of thumb is as long as you're moving forward, going from a lower version and migrating to a newer version, that should always be safe. Going backwards is the stickier detail. And about global fields, we've been having requests, well, can I keep the global fields from the clone instead of the source file? Another interesting fact about clone files is that all global data is deleted completely. So there's no way to migrate the global data from the clone to the source file. If this is really an important thing, maybe we'll figure out a way or somehow to pull globals out. Or personally, when I'm using globals, if there's a global value that really needs to be set, I tend to always put that in my startup script step to set the globals at that point. It's easy. I know where the value is all the time. It always works on every client. I don't need to worry whether I don't need to bring something down and open it on my local version and then put it back on the host. It's just what I typically do. That's what I do. So I never actually worry about it because I know my startup scripts always set the state of how I want the system completely. I know there's some use cases you can come up where saying you really need global fields that you can't use a script step to do it, but I think those are more of the edge cases. So why I'm going to be going down into this area about why you need to use ignore fonts and stuff like this. FileMaker has a table of fonts that's stored, one table of fonts that basically has the font name, some statistics about the font, different versions of the name, what the PostScript name is, what the specific operating system name of the font is, and then we map that to a number. So, you know, Helvetica may be 3, Courier may be 16, stuff like that. And then everywhere else in the file format, whenever we reference a font, we use that number. Now, for layouts and other data that's coming over from the clone that's not getting replaced, we can use the font table that's in the clone easily. The problem that comes in is that when you have style runs, when you go into a field, you select a subsection of text, and you click on it, and then you give it a different font. That will create a new entry in the font table. Now, if they're using a font that's already there, it'll use the same font that was there, and it'll get the same number, and that's never a problem. But if a user like installs some, you know, brand new font like, you know, Comic 17 or something like that, and then you use it, and that your clone has never seen that font file, a new font entry will be added into the source file. And when you, and the migration tool, when it does this migration, it'll go through and try to find all the entries that are the same. If there's space to bring over new entries that are in the source file, it'll just move them into the new table for the target file. The problem you run into is if there's a conflict, where you added a font into the clone file and someone added a different font in the source file. They'll both have the same number at that point. We'll handle this, but it does kick you from block mode into record mode at that point. So you're not doing the real fast translation. I mean, it works, and we do fix all it up. We have to look at all the records, go through all the style runs, check to see if there's any fonts that are using this conflicted ID, and go through and change the number that it's using. So it uses the new number that we had to add to the new file. But we realize, because you know, then people are saying, well, is there some way we can make the fonts equal? But you can't really make them exactly equal because all these numbers are spread throughout all your tables and all the record data. So we added this ignore fonts flag. That basically will just not do that check. It won't consider that if the fonts, there's a mismatch in the font tables or that there's a conflict in the font tables, we just won't scan the data. And most of you will probably be able to use this with the ignore fonts flag depending on your solution. I mean, if it's just financial data and no one ever puts in you know, specific fonts, or you never change your fonts, or your clone is always coming from a previous version of the file and you've never added new fonts to your new version of the solution. I guess it wouldn't get triggered in that case, but you can turn this off and then we just won't do the scan. Now if you do have a problem, what you'll see is that, you know, the formatting is lost, is that like in the before case, the Georgian sign was Lucinda Granda, but then all of a sudden in the new solution, when they open it up, it'll be in this case, the impact font instead. So the data will still be there, it's just that the font will be a different font. It'll be wherever the conflict was. It's going to have what the previous version of the conflict. So this is I mean, if the record mode translation is fast enough for you, but you may have some monster-sized tables that you don't care about the fonts inside them, so you may want to just say ignore fonts on it because you're reformatting, you know, you want the entire contents of the data or the text to be whatever the font is defined in the layout, not whatever font that the user, subsection of the font the user put in there. Let me go through some things that we're not expecting you to do with this tool. We can't prevent you from doing it, but by itself, we don't see this as a complete upgrade solution by itself. I mean, this is a low-level command line tool. We see this as part of a bigger process. I mean, there's already products out there being sold by other companies that include this as part of the product. When you're sending out updaters, it'll be part of this, because you probably will have some other things that you want to do, maybe some post scripts that you need to run or scripts that you need to run before this. Some early people were trying to use the output as a DDR and they wanted to keep adding more logging to it. That's not the purpose of this tool. We're working on a new DDR version already. That's where that effort is going into. It's not a schema inserter. We don't want to start adding new options and saying, well, okay, do all the tables except for this table and stuff like that. This new direction that we're going in where you can start dealing with chunks of file in XML, that's going to be the solution if you want to just do partial updates. This is for the main line, we're moving the entire solution up to the new version. This is the whole thing. This is not really supposed to be an editing tool, even though I've heard some people are actually using it as kind of a editing mechanism. But that's not what it's designed for. And we're probably not going to be interested in adding a fancy GUI tool on there, but I think there's at least 3 out there. I think Productive Computing, IT Solutions, and 360works, I think all have at least some front ends already out there. But let me get to this at least. Okay, how to get it. This is important. I really shouldn't skip this part. The slides will be posted so you can read this stuff later if you really want to. The way you get it is not included with the server product or the pro product directly. It's distributed separately. It's on our website. You can download it. But to get to that area, you have to be a member of the FileMaker Developer subscription, or be a member of the FileMaker Business Alliance. In the US, it's a $100 per year subscription. But you do get a test-only license to all of the entire product family. You get a license to server, advanced, and it's only for development purposes is how the license is specified. You're not supposed to do just, run companies and stuff like that off of it. But it's a cheap way just to develop stuff on there. You get access to the iOS app SDK. This has been there. This has been true ever since that SDK came out. And now the FileMaker migration tool. One thing that now, because the tool is up in this different set that is downloaded and stuff like that, we can update that faster than just waiting for the next yearly cycle of things coming out. If we come through and decide to add some things quicker to it and stuff like that. So it's independent of our yearly cycle that we have right now. The Business Alliance, you get access to the developer subscription as part of it now. I think before you actually had to buy that separately, but now those members do get that. Well, actually, this is what I'll do for the demo here. There, that's the demo. But I mean, it's a command line tool. You see the command up there. There's the output of the log. You see, I had a start time, mapping the privileges to the targets. This is the normal logging. This is not the verbose logging. It told me that I had this account, John, was changed to the privilege set, unmapped privilege sets, because there wasn't a privilege set matching there. A custom value list was updated. There was a font. It actually tells you when it's adding fonts from the source table to the destination table. So you'll see some font information coming through that way. Didn't have any table changes. So in this case, there was this global field called location that I moved to default location. I added a new location field, inventory, and then you get the summary. That summary portion down there always comes out. So the case where you're using full admin, you get this type of information. If you're using the FMMigration keyword, the only information that will come out is what's inside that summary section. But you can see the number of serial numbers that were updated, the number of repetitions that got cut down. Fields can get evaluation errors. The evaluation errors are some of the ones I mentioned before, that if there was to evaluate a calc, a plugin was required. You can tell that, oh, I couldn't do these evaluations. You don't actually have to open the file and look at it. There's a question mark, or there's going to be a question mark in there. The number of fields that were migrated, not migrated, and just kind of a handy summary information. But we can go ahead and why don't you come up to the mics to ask questions.
Is it on? For creating an empty clone, is there an option for making it self-contained? Like when taking that empty clone and putting it on an iPad, it needs to not have external references. Those external references need to be converted to internal.
Yeah, no, the tool doesn't do that automatically. You'd have to use the Pro product to collapse everything internally to do that first. There's been a bunch of options promoted. They're saying, well, why can't I specify a source file and you make the clone for me, and stuff like that. So we'll be looking at requests for features for what options we should add to it, and we'll go through, and you can maybe add that as one of the choices. Actually, I haven't heard that one yet, but there's a bunch of like post-processing and pre-processing options that people have added, which may not be hard to add. Or the other thing, what we may do is we may start just coming out with more command line tools. We may have a file, a save a copy. Okay, I guess people like that. But basically everything that you can do in save a copy that's there is that there'll be a command line tool saying, well, okay, here's this file I want to save as compacted file. Or here's a file I want to combine all the external data into the same file. That's kind of my preferred approach, is not to add necessarily more options to this tool, but maybe start adding more tools that come out. And we may have more command line tools.
What about via API?
Via the API, that causes much more linkage with other team release cycles and stuff like that. So that means instead of maybe having a 9-month time till you get the feature, you may have to wait 2 years at that point for the next to get on the next train that goes into these official releases and stuff like that. Because I mean, like, we're working on not the release coming out next year. I'm actually working on the release that comes out the year after that for that version. But the nice thing about this tool, with how it's being independent and not hooked into the rest of the ecosystem and development cycles, it can be done at a separate pace. Much like how the web stuff comes out, they kind of have a release every 3 or 4 months and stuff like that. They're not hooked into the big train that FileMaker has that's moving along. Okay.
If prior to a migration in a solution, if you go into the old copy and save a compressed copy, does that allow the migration tool to stay in block mode more?
Now, whether you save a compressed copy or not won't affect the
Or when you
block
save a copy and it makes it smaller, basically defragments your database?
Yeah. I mean, if you make it compressed before you run it through the migration tool, you may have less blocks to move around when it's in block mode. But that's even at a lower level than where the migration tool is working at, and it doesn't even know anything about that, how compressed the blocks are at that point.
So basically no in that case.
Yeah.
Okay.
First off, thank you very much for building the data migration tool. It's completely revolutionized the way we work. Somewhat following up from that, we have a database. One of our databases is 5 gigabytes, and it has container fields that occasionally get deleted. So we've compacted, and it drops down to around 4 gigabytes. When we then migrate data into a clone of that compacted database, it jumps immediately back up to 5 gigabytes. And so we then have to compact it again. Mm-hmm. It seems like every time we migrate, it forgets the fact that it was compacted. Do you have any idea why that might be?
As I mentioned yesterday, whenever you do pretty much any type of write in a FileMaker file, things start expanding and opening it up so that it can have space to add things. And especially when doing indexing, did you notice whether it was running in block mode or in record mode when it was doing that?
The vast majority was in block mode.
In a block mode? There are certain flags. I mentioned yesterday that there's these flags when you're talking with HBAM to change the decisions on how to do block splits and stuff like that. And I'm thinking that it's not, in the migration tool, it's not turning the option on to say that this is acting like an import to keep the blocks tighter. It may be running in a kind of more generic mode, saying that, oh, we're starting to do writes here, open up the space so that we can do more writes. So it may be expanding it out just because of which mode it's in there.
I can maybe follow up later.
Yeah, maybe send me,
Thank you.
Maybe I should write that down right away, because that's something I'm going to forget after today. But that would be a really easy fix. I just need to put the engine in a different mode. But I haven't actually. I tend not to compress my files, so I don't tend to notice that.
I was actually wondering if you could, if there are any features coming along, anything that you're adding to the tool that we could look forward to.
I didn't hear the last part of it.
Sorry, I was just wondering if there are any new features coming to the tool, anything that you're excited about, something that we could look forward to in recent or in upcoming releases.
Well, I guess not really for this tool. I mean, I've been playing around writing this other command line tool, so I'm more interested in writing these other tools that do these other things. So it won't be necessarily this tool that's getting that portion. Okay. For doing the other, see, I kind of see, you know, so the data migration is at the end of the development process when you're just pushing into test phase and stuff like that. But when you're having multiple users doing development, I see that the XML work that we're coming up is going to be the key point for that, where you'll be storing portions of files in Git or SVN and stuff like that and doing merges. So I see the migration tool is, you know, if we can find performance improvements and things to do that in there, but I don't see the feature set of that thing changing drastically. If anything, we're going to have new command line tools that do other things, other file maintenance tools. You know, maybe it'll just be a tool that just does a standard style import into one table or something like that. Another tool that people have been wanting is just a tool that you can open a file and just run one script in that file and then stop. We actually have some prototypes of that laying around of that also. So I'm kind of more excited in now that we actually have this command line tool and we have a place to distribute these command line tools through the FDS program, that we can start putting up more tools up there for developers like you to use, is what I'm more excited about. Yeah. So.
Thank you. The unmap privilege, is that just like a read-only access, or is that?
No access.
No access, okay.
Yeah, if you open the file, you'll see that the big kind of grayish screen saying no access in it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, and the second question I have is going back to globals.
Mm-hmm.
So if it would be great if there was a way to just like have a you know, update the globals from the clone, but I know that that's a
right.
more difficult thing because it goes back to saving it as a clone and then keeping globals in there, and that's another change at a lower level. But I think it would be really helpful.
I'm almost thinking of just having a separate command line tool that moves globals.
Yeah.
So, everything's going to be, you know, there's going to be 16 command line tools up there that do specific things like that. So, yeah, or Mike, yeah.
So you have a database that's crashed and and you have to do a recovery on it, and it gives you the message you shouldn't use this one going forward. Can that be used as input into the recovery tool or the migration tool to go into a good clone?
When I say block mode, if there's some corruption inside a field, it's going to just pick it up, move it over, and put it in the clone. It's not going to walk over. Actually, if there was some way to force it not to go into block mode and force it into record mode, that would actually kind of clean up the data as it's moving it from one side to the other. But you know, that could be. It's easy to tell it to do the slow way instead of the fast way, But actually, I'm out of time over here, and we need to get the next person up. So let me get my stuff off here so the next person can set up, and I'll be like over there if you want to ask me some more questions. So, thank you.